What if I told you, a royal family once ruled almost all of Europe, but their biggest enemy wasn't war or betrayal, it was their own blood. This is the true story of a bloodline so twisted. Their kings were born unable to chew food. One ruler couldn't walk. Another couldn't speak. Many died without children. One was so deformed, people believed he was cursed by the devil himself. But none of this was chance. It was planned. A secret choice made over generations, all to keep their royal blood pure. Their name: the Habsburgs. And their story is one of the darkest, strangest, and most disturbing secrets in European history. You may have heard of kings and queens who married for power. But the Habsburgs went further. They didn't just marry into other royal families. They married each other. Over and over. Fathers gave daughters to nephews. Uncles married nieces. First cousins became husband and wife. For more than 200 years, this was their tradition. And for a while, it worked. They grew powerful. Their empire stretched from Spain to Austria, from Italy to the New World. But behind the gold and the thrones, their children were being born broken. One baby had a jaw so large and twisted, he couldn't close his mouth. Another was so mentally slow, his court kept him hidden from visitors. One boy king lived 38 painful years and never spoke a full sentence. His bloodline ended with him. That single death marked the fall of a kingdom. But how bad was it, really? Modern scientists studied their family tree. What they found was shocking. The last Spanish Habsburg king was more inbred than the child of siblings. His genes were damaged beyond repair. His body was a time bomb. Yet for centuries, the royal family covered it all up. They lied in paintings. They buried their secrets in sealed vaults. They even claimed black magic was to blame, not the truth that their power was built on self-destruction. This video will take you deep inside their hidden story. A story of cursed blood, broken bodies, and a dynasty that destroyed itself to protect its throne. And if you watch until the very end, you'll uncover the final, disturbing truth they never wanted the world to know, a secret that still echoes through royal bloodlines today. This isn't just a dark chapter in history. It's a chilling warning of what happens when power becomes obsession. The Habsburgs weren't just rich. They weren't just royal. For centuries, they were the most powerful family in all of Europe. They didn't rise through war like others. They rose through marriage. Clever, quiet, and careful. They didn't fight for power, they married into it. Their family motto said it all: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And they did. Again and again. A daughter here. A nephew there. Soon, the Habsburg name was on the thrones of Spain, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, and beyond. They were everywhere. And for most of the world, it seemed like the Habsburgs were blessed, chosen, invincible. But behind the fancy crowns and silk robes, something strange was happening. Something nobody talked about. Their children started to look different. Their jaws grew longer. Their lips stuck out. Their faces twisted in odd ways. Doctors whispered about weak bones, slow minds, poor health. Some couldn't walk. Some couldn't speak. Some were born already dying. At first, the royal court blamed it on bad luck, then on bad spirits. Then they stopped talking about it altogether. But the truth was always there, hidden in the family tree, hidden in the blood. They had gone too far. Marriage after marriage, cousin after cousin, generation after generation, until their blood was no longer strong. It was breaking them from the inside out. The Habsburgs became a family full of secrets. They hid their sick. They faked their portraits. They kept their deformed children far from public eyes. And they kept marrying their own, hoping power would protect them. But power doesn't stop biology. Soon, the same thing happened again and again. A king would rise to the throne, sick and weak. He would rule in pain. He would die without children. And another would take his place, just as broken. This was no longer a royal family. This was a bloodline under attack, not by enemies outside the palace, but by choices made inside it. Every child born carried not just a crown, but a warning, a sign that power taken too far always has a price. And for the Habsburgs, that price was already being paid, in silence, in sickness, and in secrets no one dared to speak. Long before they became emperors, The Habsburgs were just nobles in a cold mountain castle. Their story began in the 11th century. A stone fortress in the Swiss Alps. Snow-covered peaks. Thick forests. Not much wealth. Not much power. Just land, a name, and ambition. The family took their name from that very castle, Hawk's Castle, or Habsburg in German. Over time, the name became Habsburg. But their dream was always bigger than their walls. They started small, made clever alliances, gained land, married smart, and then came a turning point, 1273. Rudolf of Habsburg was elected king of the Romans. It was the beginning of something massive. From that moment, the Habsburgs never looked back. They didn't take power by force. They didn't conquer by sword. They used marriage like a weapon. Over centuries, they mastered one skill, making political marriages that brought land, wealth, and crowns, without spilling a drop of blood. It worked like magic. They married into Bohemia, then Hungary, then Burgundy, then Spain, and each time, they got more than just land. They got titles, armies, gold mines, and thrones. By the 16th century, the Habsburg Empire stretched across Europe, from Austria to Spain, from Italy to the Netherlands. They even ruled parts of the Americas. They controlled so much territory, people said the sun never set on their empire. One man, Charles V, ruled both the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire. He was king over millions. He held more power than any man in Europe. But Charles V also made a decision that would change everything. He married his first cousin. And that was just the beginning. From that point on, the Habsburgs turned their marriage strategy inward. Instead of marrying other royal houses, they started marrying each other. Cousins, uncles and nieces, over and over. The family tree began to twist. To them, it made sense. Keep power in the family. No outsiders. No threats. But the cost of that plan would come later. For now, they were still rising. Building palaces. Collecting crowns. Winning battles without war. To the outside world, they looked untouchable. But inside, a slow rot had begun. Hidden. Quiet. Passed down with every wedding vow. The Habsburgs had built the greatest empire Europe had ever seen. But they built it on a foundation that would eventually collapse. Their own blood. And that blood was about to turn against them. At first, no one noticed. A cousin married another cousin. Then a niece married her uncle. Another cousin. Then another. It became normal. Routine. Tradition. The Habsburgs told themselves it was smart. They were protecting their legacy. Keeping their gold, their land, their crowns, all in the family. And it worked. On paper, their empire looked stronger than ever. But something was happening behind the scenes. Something slow. Silent. Dangerous. Each time two close relatives had a child, that child carried the same blood from both sides. That meant more risk. More chance of hidden problems rising to the surface. More chance of illness. Of deformity. Of mental decline. But the Habsburgs didn't believe in genetics. They believed in power. They believed in bloodlines. They thought their royal blood made them special, chosen by God. They didn't understand they were breaking the very thing they were trying to protect. One of the earliest signs came in the form of a face. Long chin. Thick lips. Jaw that jutted forward unnaturally. It became known as the Habsburg jaw. Doctors call it mandibular prognathism. For the Habsburgs, it became a signature feature, passed down like a crown. But it wasn't just about looks. That jaw caused real problems. Trouble eating. Trouble speaking. Some couldn't close their mouths. Some couldn't chew food properly. And as the generations passed, it only got worse. Other problems began to appear too. Fragile bodies. Misshapen skulls. Weak minds. Stunted growth. Infertility. Still, the marriages continued. They told the public everything was fine. Painted beautiful portraits. Held grand royal weddings. But inside the palace, the truth was harder to ignore. The bloodline was rotting from within. One Spanish king, Philip IV, married his own niece. They had a son, Charles II. That boy would later become king, but his body was broken from birth. He was small, sickly, and slow. His tongue was too large. His limbs were thin and twisted. He didn't speak until he was 4. Didn't walk until he was 8. Couldn't chew solid food. And he was never able to have children. Charles II would become the most tragic symbol of the Habsburg curse. But we'll get to him later. For now, know this: the curse was not sudden. It didn't arrive with a bang. It grew, little by little, behind closed doors. Hidden in genes. Strengthened by choices. The Habsburgs weren't cursed by witches or demons. They cursed themselves, with every wedding, and every child born from a family that refused to look outside itself. And they would pay the price for generations to come. The curse now had a face. Several, in fact. Each one more troubling than the last. Let's start with the most tragic of them all, Charles II of Spain. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. And he was born broken. From the moment he opened his eyes, doctors knew something was wrong. His jaw was so large and misshapen, he couldn't chew. His tongue was oversized, making it hard to speak or breathe properly. His body was small, weak, and frail. His bones were soft. His spine curved. His skin pale and cold. He didn't walk until the age of 8. He didn't speak clearly until much later. He often drooled. He had seizures. His mind remained that of a child. This was a boy born into gold and silk. But his life was filled with pain, isolation, and silence. Behind palace walls, people whispered. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Some believed he was cursed by sorcery. Others thought demons had entered his blood. Priests performed exorcisms. Nothing worked. But it wasn't magic. It was genetics. A result of centuries of inbreeding. Charles II's family tree was so twisted, his inbreeding coefficient, a number scientists used to measure how closely someone's parents are related, was shockingly high. It was more than twice the level seen in children of sibling relationships. His parents were uncle and niece. And that showed in every inch of his body. He married twice, hoping for an heir. But he was sterile. His line ended with him. And so did the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. But Charles wasn't alone. His father, Philip IV, also showed signs of the curse. He had the same Habsburg jaw, though not as severe. He married his niece, just like many of his ancestors. Then there was Joanna of Castile, often called Joanna the Mad. Her behavior became more and more unstable after marriage. She refused to bury her husband's body. She carried his coffin with her wherever she went, for years. People thought she had gone insane. Today, many believe it was the result of mental illness made worse by inbreeding. Even earlier, signs were there. Maximilian I, Ferdinand I, Philip I, all of them had some form of the jaw. Some had fertility problems. Some had mood swings, poor health, or difficulty speaking. But in those times, people didn't understand what caused it. They blamed God, or fate, or evil spirits. The truth was hiding in plain sight. Each face in a royal gallery carried the same features. The same chin, the same long nose, the same sunken cheeks and heavy lips. It was as if one face kept being copied again and again, getting worse each time. The portraits may look noble, but behind the oil paint, there was pain, and fear, and illness. These were not just rulers. They were victims, trapped in a dynasty that valued blood over survival. And the more they tried to protect their power, the more their bodies turned against them. The curse had taken hold. It now had a body, a face, and a crown. But science hadn't yet caught up to explain it. That part of the story comes next. Centuries after their downfall, the Habsburgs were still whispering through history, through their portraits, their palaces, their deformities. But no one knew exactly what had happened to them. Not until scientists started digging into their bloodline. And what they found was horrifying. In 2009, a team of Spanish researchers conducted a full genetic analysis of the Habsburg dynasty. They weren't working with bones or DNA samples. Those remain mostly untouched. Instead, they reconstructed the family tree using more than 3,000 individual records of marriages, births, and deaths. It was the most detailed look ever taken at the dynasty's breeding patterns. And the results were something out of a genetic nightmare. The Habsburgs had spent more than 200 years marrying within their own family. Not just cousins. but uncles marrying nieces, first cousins producing children. Sometimes, those children were then married off to even closer relatives. It was a web of shared genes looping tighter and tighter, until it strangled the dynasty from within. Scientists calculated the inbreeding coefficient, a number that shows how genetically similar your parents are. For Charles II of Spain, the last of the line, that number was 0.254. To put it in perspective, a child born from a sibling relationship has a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II number was higher. Statistically speaking, it was as if he were the product of an incestuous relationship, over and over again, across generations. The researchers found something else. The deeper the inbreeding, the shorter the lifespan of each monarch. Fertility rates dropped. Infant deaths increased. Rulers became weaker, more sickly, and more mentally unstable as time passed. And it wasn't random. It was biological collapse, genetic rot, a dynasty consuming itself in slow motion. One of the researchers, Dr. Gonzalo Alvarez, wrote that the Habsburg dynasty was an extreme example of the cost of inbreeding in humans. He called it a unique genetic laboratory. But even without blood samples, the signs were visible. Take the infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, as it's known today. A team of researchers studied 66 portraits of Habsburg royalty, painted over nearly 300 years. They measured facial proportions and angles. What they found was eerie. As in breeding increased, so did the severity of the jaw. The deformity could be seen progressing like a disease through the paintings. Art became medical evidence. Science had finally put a name, and numbers, to what the world once called a curse. But this wasn't just about the Habsburgs. Their story became a warning. A case study taught in genetics classes. A living example of how power, when kept too tightly, can destroy itself. In the past, marrying within royal families was seen as sacred, a way to preserve the bloodline, protect power, and keep outsiders out. But in doing so, they sealed their fate. The very strategy meant to make them invincible, left them broken. And that's the strange irony at the heart of this mystery. The Habsburgs ruled over millions. They shaped the map of Europe. They built empires, commanded armies, and crowned kings. But they could not escape their own blood. And while wars and politics may have weakened their grasp, it was their genes that delivered the final blow. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Habsburgs no longer ruled like gods. Their palaces still stood. Their crowns still glittered. But inside the empire, things were beginning to rot, quietly, steadily, and from within. The Spanish branch was the first to fall. Charles II of Spain, the monarch with the infamous Habsburg jaw, the one whose tongue was so oversized he could barely speak, died in 1700. He was 38 years old. He had no children, no heirs. His death didn't just mark the end of a reign, it was the death rattle of the entire Spanish Habsburg line. And yet, even in death, Charles sparked chaos. His will handed the entire Spanish Empire, the colonies, the ships, the gold, the armies, to a Bourbon prince from France. The result? A war that dragged on for over a decade. The War of Spanish Succession wasn't just about who would wear the crown. It was about the balance of Europe itself. If the French Bourbons and Spanish Habsburg territories were united, no other kingdom could compete. So England, the Dutch, the Holy Roman Empire, all stepped in. What followed was bloodshed on a continental scale. And by the end, one truth became clear: the age of unquestioned Habsburg dominance was over. But the Austrian branch held on, barely. They rebranded. They adapted. But they could not escape the shadow of their past. The empire remained vast, but increasingly fragile. Ethnic tensions grew between the Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, and countless others under Habsburg rule. Industrialization left them behind. Their military, once fearsome, began to look like a relic. By the 19th century, the empire was being kept alive by force of habit, and by one woman. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as SSI, was everything the Habsburg legacy wasn't: free-spirited, modern, and adored by the people. She tried to modernize the monarchy from within, but even she couldn't outrun the family's curse. She was assassinated in 1898 by an Italian anarchist, stabbed in the chest with a sharpened file. Then came her son, Crown Prince Rudolph. He was meant to be the future. Instead, in 1889, He was found dead alongside his teenage mistress in a hunting lodge outside Vienna. A murder-suicide. A national scandal. A dynasty cracked down the middle. The heir to the empire had killed himself, and with him, the hope for reform. After Rudolf's death, the next in line was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, that Franz Ferdinand. On June 28, 1914, he was assassinated in Sarajevo. A bullet fired by a Serbian nationalist. That bullet didn't just kill a man. It ignited World War I. And with that war, the Habsburg Empire, already hollowed out from centuries of decay, finally collapsed. In 1918, Austria-Hungary dissolved. The emperor, Karl I, was forced to abdicate. The empire split into new republics, and the Habsburg name, once feared across Europe, became a relic. No executions. No final stand in a palace courtyard. Just silence. The dynasty that once ruled half the known world disappeared, almost overnight. But even in death, the Habsburgs left behind a haunting legacy, one made not of victories or crowns, but of whispers, deformities, and strange genetic footprints that still fascinate scientists today. Their empire fell, but their mystery never did. The Habsburg Empire is gone. Its borders erased. Its monarchs forgotten by many. But the legacy? That's harder to kill. You can still find their coat of arms carved into buildings across Europe. Twin-headed eagles with outstretched wings, symbols of power and divine right. But the real legacy lies deeper, buried in blood and bone. For centuries, the Habsburgs saw themselves as chosen, not by the people, but by God. That belief justified their intermarriages, their wars, their unshakable grip on Europe. But modern science sees something else, a dynasty slowly poisoned by its own pride. In 2009, a team of geneticists studied the Habsburg family tree. What they found was chilling. The dynasty's inbreeding coefficient, a measure of genetic similarity between parents, rivaled that of offspring born to incestuous unions. And the consequences were catastrophic. Scientists believe that the infamous Habsburg jaw, the protruding, oversized mandible seen in so many portraits, wasn't just a cosmetic oddity. It was a symptom of mandibular prognathism, likely worsened generation after generation by repeated consanguinity. But that wasn't the worst of it. Infertility, mental illness, developmental delays, epilepsy, all whispered through royal halls, hidden behind velvet curtains and golden crowns, all passed silently from cousin to cousin, as marriages tightened the genetic noose. Modern medicine now uses the Habsburg dynasty as a case study in the dangers of inbreeding, not in backwards myths, but in royal courts. But their legacy isn't just a cautionary tale of DNA. They left behind something far stranger, a mistake. The Habsburgs, with all their power and tragedy, have become something close to legend. Their story reads like Gothic fiction, a family blessed by destiny and cursed by design, a lineage so consumed by control that they unraveled themselves. Filmmakers, writers, and conspiracy theorists still feed off their shadows. Some believe the Habsburgs were hiding more than genetic secrets, that they possessed occult knowledge, passed down through ancient texts and secret orders. That their obsession with purity wasn't just political, it was esoteric. Others point to the eerie parallels between their collapse and later global powers. Empires overreaching, rulers detached from the people, warnings written in marble and blood. But perhaps the most haunting piece of their legacy is how easily they vanished. One moment, they ruled continents. The next, they were ghosts. Their descendants still live today, scattered across Europe, stripped of crowns, carrying only names. Some entered politics. Others lived quiet, anonymous lives. But none could reclaim the throne. Not because they weren't ambitious, but because the world had changed. No more divine rights. No more royal marriages for power. The age of kings was over. And yet, if you look closely, the Habsburgs still linger. In portraits hanging in Viennese museums. In the strange medical textbooks on inherited deformities. In the way history whispers warnings about bloodlines and unchecked power. They remind us that even the most powerful can collapse, not with gunfire, but with a kiss between cousins. Not with rebellion, but with time. Because in the end, the greatest empire they built wasn't made of stone or steel. It was the illusion of immortality. And like all illusions, it shattered. So what do we make of it all? A family that ruled half the world. That bent history with arranged marriages and iron wills. That believed itself eternal and vanished like smoke. Was it destiny? Madness? Or just the slow, silent price of human ambition left unchecked? The Habsburgs weren't just rulers. They were architects of a strange reality, one where political power was inherited like a disease, passed through bloodlines too twisted to survive. They carved out an empire not just with armies, but with wedding rings. And for a time, it worked. They stood above popes, commanded kings, rewrote borders. But inside their palaces, something was rotting. Not just the jaws and spines of future heirs, but the very foundation they stood on. Control without balance, faith without reason, legacy without humanity. And that is the true warning the Habsburgs leave behind. Because this wasn't a story of war and conquest alone. It was a story of fragility hidden beneath grandeur. Of masks worn too long. Of dynasties built on the illusion that power could be hoarded, perfected, made pure. History doesn't remember their glory as much as it remembers their strangeness. The twisted faces in royal portraits. The cousin marriages that defied common sense. The eerie silence in the end, when the last of them slipped away, not with a bang, but with a medical chart and a shrug from history. And yet, that silence speaks louder than any crown. It whispers through the empty halls of Schönbrunn Palace. It echoes in the paintings, where eyes seem just a little too vacant. It lingers in the mystery, that something was never quite right about them. That behind the gold and velvet, there was always something broken. So the next time you pass a portrait of a royal with a protruding jaw, or hear of a family bound too tightly by tradition, remember the Habsburgs. Not just for what they built, but for what it cost. Because in the end, they weren't just rulers of an empire. They were prisoners of their own blood. And that is what made them unforgettable. If stories like these leave you thinking long after they end, you'll want to stay with us. More forgotten truths and strange histories await. Subscribe and step deeper into the shadows of the past.